before I start. Okay. You guys able to see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm guessing most of you are in India, so good evening to you. It's a cloudy 10 a.m. for me here in Chicago, but I'm happy to be here and happy to speak with you this morning. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic that I'm pretty passionate about, which is online public documentation. I think the concept of online documentation shouldn't be new for anyone. I think probably most of us, depending on the industry or the sector that you work in, you probably deal with online documentation. But the key piece here is public documentation, having it fully available online. Users can Google it, it's fully indexed, searchable, all of that sort of thing. It's not behind a username and password. It's available on the internet for anyone to view, regardless of whether someone's a client or a user of yours or not. So let's jump in. My name's Adam Evans. I am here in Chicago. I work at Strata Decision Technology, which is a healthcare financial software. But I'm not going to talk about my company or what my team does. I'm really going to focus on sort of the concept of online documentation. I provided my email address there, so if in the future you ever want to get in touch with me or you have some questions after this, I'm always happy to correspond, so feel free to reach out. And I wrote on here that I want to be a tech writer when I grow up because, you know, even though I am a tech writer, I think we're always learning, always advancing, and trying to keep up with what's going on in the industry. So it's always a continuous evolving process, right? So I hope that we all strive to be tech writers when we grow up. So the first thing that I want to start with is a section that I'm calling Dispelling the Myths, or debunking the myths, I guess is another way to say it. And this is lies that people tell themselves about help content. And when I say people, I don't mean us, the technical writers. I think we're actually pretty well versed in like what the value of help documentation, and we know what it can do for an organization. When I say people, I mean usually the stakeholders that we work with. So maybe it's the managers that we report to, or the executives in our company, or our subject matter experts. Anyone in our organization who has a vested stake in the documentation, but they aren't as well versed in the value of online documentation as we are. So we're going to go through two myths, and these are the two most common myths that I've heard in my career about why documentation shouldn't be online and publicly available. So the first myth is the competitive advantage. So this is far and away the most common thing that I hear from critics of online documentation. And this is the idea where people say, having online documentation available to anyone in the world really allows our competitors to access the documentation and see what the organization is doing, and then they can run off and do the same thing. So therefore, we're losing our competitive advantage as an organization. And it's all because the documentation is online, right? Like that's their number one thing. The documentation's online, people can see it, so we're not staying competitive, or we're not staying ahead of the competition. So a couple of points about this. So one is the content that we write contains a couple of things: feature overviews, scenarios, procedures and tasks, maybe sometimes some technical specifications, a few other things. But by and large, it's prose about the products that we're writing. It tells people how to use the products that we're writing about, right? The content that we write does not contain secrets to how we code our product. So we're not publishing our source code that our developers have created. And we're not providing instructions for how to build a competing product, right? people can maybe see how our product works, but they still have to go and build that product, which takes time and money. So when you think about it, reading the documentation really tells a competitor little more than they would learn by reading our marketing material, right? Like our marketing materials tell people what our product does, just like our technical documentation does. The documentation is just often a little bit more detailed. And I think no one would argue that the marketing material should be behind lock and key, right? And so when you think about it even more, reading the documentation tells a competitor nothing more than the competitor would learn by playing around with the product itself. And that's usually how the tech writer learns about the product, right? Is, obviously we have access to subject matter experts, but we're also in the product playing around, figuring out how to use it and what to do. And if you think that your competitors don't have access to your product, I provide the following evidence to the contrary. So one, they might hire former employees. So if they do that, then the employee brings over all the trade secrets and all of the knowledge about the product and informs that company of what the organization is doing. The competitor hires former clients. So maybe a client has used your product and then for whatever reason they switch to this other product. Well, that client obviously is well versed in what the product does and even probably has some of your materials that they could share with the other organization. Or the competitor hires their spouse or their friend uses your product at work or in their personal time. So there's a number of ways. If someone really wants to get their hands on your product, they can. And so if we agree that competitors already know about our product as much as they can, then reading the documentation, then hiding the documentation does nothing to deter competitors and everything to deter customers, right? And having frustrated customers is obviously not a competitive advantage. So let's just have documentation out there and readily available. Myth number two, which is sort of related with the competitive advantage piece, is that documentation exposes the weaknesses of the product. So this is the idea that if users can read all about our product, or if competitors can read all about our product, they can determine what our product's weaknesses are from the documentation, and then they can exploit them in discussions with prospects or whoever. I disagree with this as well, because clients already have access to a ton of material that's readily available on our websites or out in the world about us. So clients have access to sales briefs that our sales folks have put together that already talk about what our product does well and maybe what our competitors' products don't do so well. They have access to, again, the marketing material together that highlights everything that our product does. So if users really wanted to sort of determine what the weaknesses are, they could read our marketing materials or sales materials and do the same thing. And then also there's third-party reviews, again, depending on what industry you're in, there's third-party reviews out there on many products and many industries that genuinely highlight what the weakness of a product is. So in most cases, all clients have to do is Google your product, and they can find a list from third-party reviews about what they do well and what they don't. So again, the documentation does nothing that materials from all over the organization don't already do. And so there's no harm in having the documentation out there. So those are the two myths that I hear most about. And we've really spent this first 10 minutes kind of being on the defensive, right? So someone comes to you and says, competitors are going to get our documentation, or you're documenting our weaknesses, you're exposing our weaknesses. And so we're on the defensive. But where I like to live is on the offensive, which is sort of being proactive about what is the exciting opportunity that public online documentation can do for an organization. So let's head off some of these concerns before we even hear from anyone. So what works well about having public online documentation? Well, the first thing is that we get to join the conversation that's going on about our organization and about our product. Documentation helps build the brand of your product. It's part of your organization's assets, and an organization would do well to realize that. Sometimes you have to convince people of the value of documentation, but a good organization realizes that having public online documentation out there is an asset to the organization. For example, Aaron Fulkerson, who wrote an article for Forbes called The Evolution of User Manuals, said documentation, once siloed in the realm of how-to guides, is actually feeding top of the funnel activity. In fact, some companies I've spoken to are reporting that their documentation is bringing in over 50% of their qualified leads. Now, I can't say that I've ever worked for an organization where this is true. Certainly, the majority of our prospective users of organizations that I've worked for have not come from documentation. But I have worked for organizations where our public documentation assists with the sales process. So we have won sales because users see the documentation online. They see the rich amount of resources we have. They see that they're going to be supported and that answers to their questions exist. And so due in part to the documentation, they become a client and sign on to the organization, which I think is a really powerful selling point for the value of documentation, right? We're helping win sales. Organizations that I've worked for that don't have public documentation, that's not part of the conversation. People don't even realize the documentation can be that value add for the organization. And so I've seen documentation teams kind of flounder when they're kept behind lock and key. But when documentation's public, it really appeals to a lot of prospective customers. So I would say that's a huge, huge win in becoming part of that conversation. Opportunity number 2 is if we don't do it, someone else will. So your company that you work for, your organization, probably has done a really good job of building a community of really passionate users who love to talk about your product. I think in this day and age, in technology and software companies, having a really enthusiastic user base is just par for the course. It just happens a lot. Tech companies often have online social networks or support centers or online communities where users can come and share ideas or ask questions and interact with one another. People are answering each other's questions. This happens a lot. It's not uncommon anymore. And as a result, users sort of, whether intentionally or unintentionally, start essentially documenting your product. They're answering questions. They're telling people how to do things. They're telling people how to accomplish their goals within your product. And sometimes they post these answers online or on their own websites or on a blog or wherever, and then that becomes indexed by Google and other users can find it. And that's great, right? We want our users to be passionate. We want our users to document what's going on. We want them to be talking about our product online. That's great. But we don't want their voice to be the only voice that's heard. So, for example, these customers are dedicated. They're writing this content because they're passionate about the product, but they don't have the time or the energy or the incentive to necessarily keep their materials up to date. So as fast as our product evolves, it's very likely that those materials that your users have created become outdated quite quickly. And so if someone Googles your product, you want people to find reliable information from a source of truth that they can trust, which it should be you and your team of technical writers. Think about it. How much would you trust an organization if you Googled how to do something in a product and you found pages of instructions from other sources than the organization itself? So you want your organization to be at least on the first page of search results when it comes to people searching for information about your organization. The next opportunity is having public online documentation really signals to the market that you are an innovator in this industry and you are an innovator in your space. So technology isn't really a sustainable differentiator anymore, right? So there's so much competition, there are so many companies out there, and the speed of technological innovation moves so fast that just having a really awesome product isn't enough for a company to be successful. You need other offerings to be the best of the best. And documentation can be one of those offerings. Help materials and answering users' questions, a reputation of good support, documentation being part of that good support, can really help an organization get to the next level. So having online documentation, having users be able to find what they need quickly and when they need to find it, can really help your organization rise to the top of all of their competitors in the market. So again, it goes back to that myth of public documentation is not a disadvantage when it comes to competition. It can really be and should be an advantage to beating the competition. Opportunity number 4 is that public documentation helps reduce customer churn. So what is churn? In this context, what I mean is churn is the process that customers go through to find the answers that they're looking for. So I'm sure in your organizations or at some point in your career, you've seen this play out where a user has a question, they don't know where to find the answer, they're Googling it online, they're searching all of your company's materials, whether it's training or documentation or something a salesperson sent to them. They're writing to support sends that email to the training team gets in touch with you, you happen to have the answer, and then it goes back down the funnel to the user. All that whole process takes time, takes effort, and then of course takes money from the company. And that whole process is the churn of users finding answers. Having online help, having one single source of truth that users can go to, brings all of the documentation, all of the resources together and reduces customer churn. The online help site becomes the single source of truth, and over time, because it's kept up to date, it's always correct, it's easy to use, it's easy to search, right? All of these things that we strive for, it becomes the trusted source of truth. And users really grow to love it and always go there. And in turn, it can increase revenue with existing customers. And how can it do that? It's because your help website would have all the information about your product or products on the website, and through cross-linking or just having that content appear side by side, users can see, oh, this is available, I don't have that available, let me inquire about that. And they might be more likely to sign on or sign up for another piece of your product or purchase something that they didn't already have, or at the very least, just become interested in learning more, which is all about the sales process. So again, you're bringing value to your customers and your organization through documentation and potentially earning sales for your organization, which turns the doc team into a profit center instead of just a cost center, right? And then the final opportunity that I wanted to talk about is that it's simply a tech writing best practice. Open source documentation is really the standard in online documentation. In fact, some companies are creating truly open source documentation, meaning that it's editable by their users and it's sort of crowdsourced. Now, that's a whole different presentation. That's like a different approach to documentation, right? There's a number of risks and benefits and a whole infrastructure that you need in place to support that. But that is really something that's happening with a lot of organizations. So it's something to think about. But just having online documentation, I think, is sort of the status quo of the industry today. When you think about any of the big tech names that most of our organizations strive to be like, Google, Amazon, Facebook, what have you, all of their documentation is online and fully accessible, fully indexed. Anyone can search for it, whether you're a user of those tools or not. And so when we are looking for how best to present documentation, and I'm sure in the meetings you've been with, you've heard people reference, well, at Google, they do it this way, or at Facebook, they do it this way. The same can be true for documentation. If everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't we do it? And it's truly become a best practice. Now, I will say, I completely understand that in some industries, some sectors of some industries, or depending on what your product is, having online public documentation isn't feasible. I totally get that. Like some finance, maybe healthcare, some industries just can't have their documentation online for security reasons or privacy reasons, what have you. And that's totally fine. So I'm not advocating that everyone, regardless of what industry you're in or what you're doing, you need to have online documentation. But I think 9 times, maybe 8 times out of 10, let's say, having online documentation can really assist an organization instead of be a deterrent or a negative piece of the puzzle. So I wanted to sort of wrap things up here with a quote. And this is my quote, so I'm quoting myself. I know it's very humble of me, but I think that the fears that I've seen around people having information falling into the wrong hands or whatever their concerns are have really failed to materialize, in my experience, in a way that costs more than the benefits gained by the community building of having online documentation. So I'm not saying that if you have online documentation that's publicly available for everyone, it's going to be all sun and roses all the time. There may be unfortunate things that happen. There may be a competitor who takes advantage of your public documentation and does something to sort of get the best of you in the industry. But that's one instance where hopefully on a daily basis, your users are getting such a positive experience out of having your online documentation available to them that outweighs the 1, 2, or a handful of negative experiences that happen. And that's really what I try to drive home with any critics that I encounter to having online documentation. We can't be overreactive to one bad situation. We want to make sure that we're pushing forward and looking at the big picture of and weighing the benefits to the costs that we have. And again, in my experience, the benefits far outweigh the costs that are involved with having publicly accessible online documentation. So that's what I had to share with you today. I know it's a little under 30 minutes, and I know it's a little bit later in India for you guys, so hopefully you don't mind the shorter presentation. But I'm happy to field any questions that you might have or answer anything about what I do. Again, my email address is aevansb, as in boy, @gmail.com. So I'm happy to receive follow-ups as well. But is there anything, I don't know how you guys usually do questions. Can people speak up? Do you do chat?
Hi, Adam. Shrutika here.
Sure.
So we have one question in the chat box. Actually, it's a comment, and the person who asked that would like to know your opinion on that. So her comment is Tanushri has commented that a common question raised is online help, or rather, hosting online help can be expensive. So, what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, online help can be expensive. So your organization likely already has a hosting platform online. So, like your corporate website is online, likely your product is online. If it's, you might be in a different sector. If you're not in technology or software, that doesn't apply. But if your product is already online, then you already have hosting available to you. And putting the documentation online, I would always advocate that the documentation should be on the same base URL, the same domain as your product or your corporate website. And so you can either create a microsite under that, like help dot whatever your domain is, or yourdomain.com/help, or whatever, however your organization wants to do it, because that makes it easy to find, it makes it predictable, and that shouldn't cost too much extra because they're already paying for hosting on those domains. If that's not the case, then you sort of have to, again, pitch the value of having online documentation, and hopefully, using some of the points that we discussed today could be helpful with that. But in my experience, I haven't run into cost issues because my organizations already have an online presence that we can just sort of attach to, if that makes sense.
Tanushree, I hope you got your answer here from Adam. Okay, so we have a few more questions, Adam.
Okay.
Is there any tool which can be integrated with our writing work to identify any plagiarism occurrences?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know of a tool that can do that. There probably is. I haven't really looked into that or made use of anything. I personally am not concerned about plagiarism. So I assume the question is in regard to like someone taking your materials, like a competitor or someone else, and sort of misusing them or misrepresenting them maybe. If that's the case, I'm not overly concerned about that. Again, I try to focus my energy on like making our product offering like the documentation the best it can be and the user experience the best it can be. And sort of thinking through the mantra of like, if you build it, they will come. Meaning, if you have an awesome setup for your users, they're going to use that, and they're not going to use whatever bootleg version that someone else copied. So I'm not going to spend my energy trying to hunt down copycats. But so the short answer is no, I don't know of any tools, but I'm sure that they exist out there. So sorry, I can't answer your question.
All right. So we also have a couple of more questions in the chat box, and I believe Ashish has his hand raised to ask a question. Ashish, if you are here, you can go ahead and ask it. Ashish? Okay. I don't see Ashish here. Okay, one more question, Adam. What are the best tools for online documentation? And Shubhadeepa has asked this question, and she has mentioned a few tools like Madcap Flare and Adobe RoboHelp, but many still prefer WordPress to expensive tools. So what factors to focus on while choosing a tool for online docs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my team currently uses Madcap Flare, and that's what we use to author and maintain our online documentation. But as you noted, that can be an expensive tool, and we have a maintenance plan, and we're throwing a lot of money at it. And I realize that that's not always an option for everyone. So I do think some of these tools like Flare and RoboHelp, they're great if your company or yourself is willing to pay for it. Then I think those are some great industry standard tools. But they come with a lot of bells and whistles that I think aren't always necessary. One of the most successful online documentation setups I've seen are wikis. So there are several, like even Confluence, and you can get sort of some cheap licenses for Confluence out there, and there are other wikis that are available too that do pretty much everything you need to do. And you can have an internal environment where you author and update the documentation, and then you can publish it to an external environment where users see it just as a website. They don't even realize it's a wiki. Or, as I was saying, a lot of companies, not a lot, some companies set up their documentation to be truly open source. So I think it just really depends on your budget. So that's one thing. And then what factors to focus on would be, what are you trying to accomplish with your documentation? So do you want it to be interactive? Do you want users to be able to comment on it? Should they be able to favorite pages? That sort of thing. Obviously, those would be requirements that you need to look for in a tool. But if you really just want a website that they're able to access, I think starting simple and then expanding from there can be easy. So going for these cheap or even free tools like a wiki can be really helpful. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. I think a lot of times people get sort of excited about like, oh my gosh, we need to have it look perfect in order to go out. I truly believe in starting simple, and then as you find success, just adding and building onto it. Because maintaining a website, as some of you may know, it can be a full-time job. You're going to run into all sorts of formatting and coding issues, and you don't want to get too complex from the beginning.
I hope that answered your question, Shobhadipa. Thanks, Adam. So we have a few more questions, and we also have time. So next question is again from Tanushri. She asks, how should a sole technical writer in an organization begin with it? Because it can be very overwhelming. I agree with Tanushri, and on top of that, it can be especially overwhelming to convince the decision makers.
Yes, absolutely. I think being a sole technical writer is one of the hardest jobs in the industry. If you don't have a team to support you or have stakeholders in your company who really understand what you do, it can really be a challenge. And so you have to sort of show and demonstrate the worth and value of the technical documentation. So my advice to sole technical writers is always to learn what your stakeholders are looking for and what their vision for the documentation is. So the company hired you, so they wanted a technical writer for some reason. So whoever hired you, go to them and find out what's your vision for the documentation and start there. So if they just want PDF manuals, then let's create some PDF manuals first, right? Like let's give them what they're looking for. And then as you build out content, you're gonna create a library of content in your free time, which I know is, we all have loads of free time, I get it. Start putting that together in some online format that can show the value of what you're working with. So if you're creating it in Word, let's say Microsoft Word, you can get access to a free wiki and easily import those Word documents. You don't have to spend a lot of time formatting and making it look perfect. And then create this mini online site and show people, how it could be or what it could be. Or find a company that has online documentation that you think is great and show your stakeholders like, hey, we could create the same thing. I can create the same thing. Here's how, and here's what I need. And that's what we're going to do. So I would say, my advice is don't go to your management or your stakeholders right away and say, this is what I want to do. I think first, build out some content, show your worth, and show them that you're, sort of answering to what they're looking for you to do, and then slowly introduce this concept of online documentation into the conversation.
That's a great approach. So Adam, one question from me. In addition to what you explained, you spoke about going to our stakeholders and asking them about what their vision is, what their goal is. So I had been in a situation where the stakeholder asked me to take a decision, but when I said I want to put it online, publicly available, people can Google and find out our documentation. The idea was shot down, at least in the beginning, citing the same reasons that the same myths that you talked about right at the beginning of your session. So for such
Mhm.
stakeholders who are high up in the decision making ladder, so how do you present some metrics? What kind of metrics can we present them to convince that this is going to, for example, this is going to reduce your support tickets by this many by this number, or it's going to reduce your man hours from the support team by these many hours, something like that. So what can we do in such situations?
Yeah, great question. I think it's very challenging. So if you have, I just want to acknowledge that first. If you have stakeholders or management who is against putting documentation online, the answer may be you can't do it. You have to listen to your boss, right? If he doesn't want to do it or she doesn't want to do it, you can't do it. But you can try to build a case for it. And so one thing that I would recommend is your organization likely already has an online website somewhere, right? Like their corporate website or their support center or what have you. They likely already have a web presence. And so what I would do is I would go to whoever manages that web presence and see if they have any metrics about how many people
Mm-hmm.
are accessing that website and what search terms, if any, people are using to find that website or they're using on that website. And I would specifically look for search terms that start with how to do something or doing something. So what you're looking for is hopefully a large volume of people searching online for how to do something with your product. And then you can take those metrics back to your stakeholders and say, look, we have X number of people searching every month on our website for how to do something, and they're not finding it because we don't have our documentation online. If we put our documentation online, hopefully it's a big number, hopefully it's compelling. These X number of people, in theory, would find what they're looking for. We need to go to where our users are. They're online. They're looking for things on our website. So let's go show them. So that's a hard metric that you can show
Mm-hmm.
people,
Right.
especially if you have a support center or something akin where people are genuinely looking for answers. You can say, we have all the answers right here in the documentation. If we put that online, people are going to use it. We have an audience. Let's meet that audience. So that's one way. As far as like the support ticket thing, I'm going to be honest, I've never seen that be successful, but I've never worked
Mm-hmm.
for an organization that has like a good metric for like, here, it's in theory, it sounds good. Like, here's our number one question we always get in support. And then, then you could put your documentation online and track how that number one question really goes down because people are finding the answer. If you can do that, I think, again, in theory, it sounds good. I have not been successful with that approach. I've been more successful with tracking the usage of what people are looking for, and then once we have online documentation, tracking the usage of the online documentation to really show that, like, hey, there's so many people accessing it, so many people are searching for things. We're
Mm-hmm.
really serving a need here. So I hope that sort of answers your question a little bit.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does. It does.
Yeah. Hi,
So
yeah, Shrutika, are you able to hear me now?
yes. So,
Yeah, sorry.
Ashish, just one moment. So, Adam, the funny thing here in my situation was this was for a web application, and they didn't want their help to be online. So, it was sort of funny to shoot down my idea of having an online documentation. So,
Yeah. What was their reason for not wanting it online?
the same reasons that you cited, that competitors will come to know what we have in our product, so they will steal our ideas. So
Yeah,
my counter was that at the most they can steal your idea, they cannot still develop it. We don't put out our code in the documentation, right?
exactly.
So
And yes, I totally agree. And along with that, I always tell people competitors have access to our product. Like, if you don't think they do, then you're really fooling yourself, because if people really want
exactly,
to get access to it, they can get access to it. So hiding the
exactly.
documentation does nothing to deter competitors. I realize that's hard to convince other people, but it's true.
I totally agree with your argument.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Adam. So
Yeah.
Ashish, you had a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shrutika, and sorry I was like having some issues. So thanks, Adams, for this wonderful knowledge sharing. I just wish to check, like, when you add your content to the for a global reach, then you also have a issue of indexing that content via Google search or Google console. So do you follow some kind of strategy where you are indexing it so that a person who is searching in a Google search, and he comes and directly lands to that particular page or something like that?
Yes, we do. We have a number of SEO, so search engine optimization practices that we follow, and I don't think it's anything revolutionary. Like you could Google like search engine optimization and find out 100 different ways to index your site. But we use, so again, my team uses Madcap Flare. Madcap Flare has some built-in SEO options and indexing. I think they call them concepts that you can add to topics that help with SEO. And then we do some custom SEO on our actual site in our code to help with search terms and, what are they called? Synonyms, that sort of thing. Like if people Google this, what they're likely looking for is this. And so we want to raise that in the search results. So yeah, that is something that we do. Honestly, my team could probably be a little bit better about it. It takes, a lot of time and effort, and there's always a release and a million other things to do. But we do try to keep our site optimized for search.
Hey, Adam, thanks for that. That really helps me. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So we had another question about SEO. So I think Tanushree, Adam also sort of answered your question along with Ashish's question. So another question that we have here is from Kalpana. What are the online help tools available in market that allows topic-based authoring or data, that supports topic-based authoring or data?
That's a great question. I think, so I have never worked in a DITA environment, so I'm not that well versed in DITA. I know what DITA is, of course, but I've never worked with it. But as far as topic-based authoring, I think almost any of the tools that are available in the market offer topic-based authoring. So again, we use Madcap Flare. I know RoboHelp does. Those are like the two main tools. FrameMaker also does topic-based authoring. Those are like the three sort of enterprise-wide tools that are probably more on the expensive side. And then I am really a fan of wiki documentation, whether you use it like a true wiki that anyone can edit, or you just lock it down, like your internal team edits it and then you publish it online, so it's like a normal website. I think wikis are really powerful. They're all online. They're all cloud-based. You can access them from anywhere in the world. So especially in this, these COVID times when we're likely all working from home, that's great. So wikis like Confluence is huge, but there are tons of other wikis out there. There are some wikis that are specific for technical documentation, and I'm forgetting the name. Let me look. Let me see if I can find it really quick. MindTouch. If you've heard of that wiki, it's called MindTouch, MindTouch, MindTouch. That is a wiki tool that is specifically designed for technical writers and technical documentation. So I definitely recommend looking into that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Adam.
Sure.
But Confluence doesn't support data or topic-based authoring. Right now, we use Confluence. So that's one of the limitations of Confluence.
I see. Yeah. That can definitely be a challenge for sure. So yeah, I think probably then more of the traditional enterprise tools like Flare, RoboHelp, FrameMaker, that sort of thing.
Right.
I'm
have
sure
one more question.
Yep, sure. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so in one of your slides, you were mentioning about, the 50% of leads coming from the documentation, something like that.
Yeah.
So shouldn't technical writing be focusing on the product and aim to reduce the support calls instead of trying to sell the product?
Yes, it absolutely should, and it does. What that quote was saying was that because the online documentation was online, when prospective clients were investigating the company, they would stumble across the documentation, and which is a great way to sort of check out the product, right? Like you're seeing what's possible, what you can do, what you can't do, and it was becoming a sales tool without anyone intending it to be. So
Okay.
my point was just that that's a benefit of having online documentation. So you're telling people how to use the product, you're reducing support tickets, you're being truly, you have true technical documentation. But because it's available for even prospective clients to see, it helps with the sales process.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Adam, we have few more questions. Akash asks, are there any specific criteria to consider while choosing an online documentation platform or tools?
Yes, you should definitely go through some sort of requirements gathering process with your team and or your stakeholders. Again, that kind of goes to an earlier question where you want to determine what you want your online documentation to do. So I can't tell you specific things to look for because it would truly depend on your situation. Do you want to have embedded search in your help? Probably. Do you want to be able to single source your content? Probably. Those sorts of things would go into a list of requirements when you're looking at tools. I think too, if you've never dealt with an enterprise technical writing piece of software like Flare or RoboHelp, there are probably features that you're not even aware of that you might look at just what that tool can do and decide whether that's a must-have for you or just a nice-to-have, and then that would go onto your list of requirements. So it truly depends on your situation. So otherwise, sorry, I can't be more specific, but I'm happy to chat about it. If you have some more questions, you could email me.